Could I ask directors to take their seats, please? Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Electoral Area Services Committee for Wednesday, March the 4th. And prior to adoption of the agenda, I'd just like to take an opportunity to share a couple of thoughts in regards to, and maybe it's more like pulling the curtain back on a process that not a lot of us are might be aware that happens. And I just want to speak to a little bit about the preparation of our agendas and how we get to what we'll be working on today. The purpose of having an agenda that is published in advance is so that we have the opportunity for the public to review our agendas. It's good as far as transparency knows. People can have an opportunity to review the material in advance and know what the business of their local government will be conducting when they go to the meeting. It helps to inspire confidence in the work that's being done. And so for those of you that don't know, staff do a lot of work. Our friend Jennifer over there spends a great deal of her time preparing the material, and it is reviewed by staff. And in the case of Electoral Area Services Committee, it's reviewed by myself generally the Thursday in advance of it being published. For other committees, there is a group of chairs and staff that review those committees' agendas as well. And sometimes there's reordering, sometimes things are moved in and out of agendas so that we have good flow and that we're not sitting here all day long sometimes. So a fair bit of effort goes into that, and then they're published on the Thursday or the Friday, and that's where all of us as directors and the public have an opportunity to review the material. And that brings me to where we do have a section in our agenda that is new business, and every director has the right to bring forward new business should they feel that it is emergent or it's an unforeseen item or it may be time sensitive. But in general, we try to discourage new information being brought before the committee at the last minute, because it's very difficult for us as the decision makers to be able to consider something on the spot without having the benefit of perhaps some staff input or the opportunity just to read and reflect. So that's how we get to these agendas being before you. And with that, I'll call the meeting to order, and I've got a couple of notes for today's agenda. We have some supplemental items that should be on all of your desks for R4, and we will be pulling recommendation number 2 from item R3, and we will be pulling recommendation number 2 from R7. So with those changes, could we have a motion to approve the agenda as amended? Moved by Director Yanni DiNardo, seconded by. Do we have a seconder? Still looking for a seconder for the approval of the agenda. Can you highlight those again? I can read it again. Yes, we have supplemental items that are all on your desk. We have recommendation to pull recommendation number 2 in R3, and to pull recommendation number 2 in R7. So moved by Director Yanni DiNardo. Looking for a seconder. Do we need a seconder before we start discussing the agenda, or do we do it in advance? Can we take questions now? My understanding, staff have made recommendations on both those items. Do you require more?
Well, sure. I'm curious as to what the reasoning was behind R7 number 2.
Well, staff,
not that I oppose
staff
it. I just
will
like
be
to
up
know.
discussing it, and you can ask that question of them when the item comes before them. Is that
But then
fair
it'll be
enough?
too late to have it as a motion.
Ms. Harrison?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R7, recommendation number 2. If you look in your agenda package, the full package, the staff report only contains recommendation number 1. The agenda cover sheet still contain recommendation number 2. The reason being is that in between the time that this agenda was drafted and the publication date, recommendation number 2 was dealt with at Regional Services Committee, so it's no longer applicable. So just recommendation number 1 is outstanding.
Yes. Still looking for a seconder. By the way, if we don't get a seconder, the meeting's over. Approval of the agenda. Oh, thank you. Any further discussion on the agenda? Director Acton.
Well, I'm just going to review this again, but I think there might have been something else that was missed then too that doesn't match with the staff report and what's here, so I can bring that up at the time.
Absolutely. No, we can discuss it when the item comes before us. Seeing no other hands, call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. Ms. Harrison, next item, number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item number 2 is adoption of the minutes. The recommendation before you is that the minutes of the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of February 19th, 2020 be adopted.
Moved by Director Yanni DiNardo, seconded by Director Smith. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. Ms. Harrison, any business arising?
There is none, Mr. Chair.
Next, we come to the public input period. And this is an opportunity for members of the public to provide input to committee members on items on today's agenda. And the procedure is before you, and I would invite anyone that would like to provide input to the committee that now is your time to line up at the microphone and provide that input. Please come forward, press the button on the base of the microphone, and you have 3 minutes. You have to press the
I
button.
haven't done that yet. I know
There you
you were
go.
going to do this part, though. Okay. My name's Norman Marcy. I'm here to speak to R4 on your agenda. My wife and I have applied for a development permit, and we did that in 2019 in January, and we've had, let's say, a bit of a time getting through to this point, but we're happy to be here today. I believe that 3 out of the 4 closest neighbors to us have provided emails or letters of support to you, which you should probably have from staff. And a little bit of history, this property's been in the family for 50 years, and what we're proposing here, and we've used it for camping, what we're proposing here is to remove the existing 30-foot travel trailer and roof structure that's over it and replace it on that footprint, a 720 square foot cabin. So, and we're trying to conform with the R2 zoning. As you know from a couple of years ago, the board refused to create a special zone there, R2 recreational zoning. So we're back to R2 and we're trying to satisfy that R2 zoning. So I want to talk about the environmental focus that we've taken with all of this. We've been, decent stewards of that property, not destroyed the lake water interface. We've got 7 of the 10 meters of waterfront is all that we use as a beach. Otherwise, it's native plants and so on. We've engaged engineers in 3 key areas. I think there's 5 or 6 engineers involved in our application already to get to this point, but Island Health Jurisdiction has approved a type 2 sewage system. It's an Elgin system, a 2-stage pre-treatment process that's specified in our application, produces a better than secondary treatment effluent. We intend to use a helic pile system for the foundations, which would mean that we'd have no excavation and no disruption of the tree roots and so on, so that the existing tree canopy and trees on site stay. Roof water handling, we've also got an engineered structure for retention of that water and a swale for dispersion so that it stays on the property and is handled well.
Mr. Marcy, I just
Yes.
recommend, so we've got a lot of this material as part of our staff report. You're almost out of time. I would
Okay.
suggest that you hit key points in relation to the variance
All right,
and the development permit, and I think we're needing to have committee move an extension for him to complete his thoughts. Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Please continue.
All right.
Oh, pardon me, all in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed, motion carries. Please continue.
so the key element here is that we are intending a 4.3% lot coverage when the R2 zoning allows us to do 30. We have a 30-meter setback from the natural boundary of the lake. And the variance that we're looking for is that we can't get away from the 164-meter elevation requirement because there isn't enough land in those properties and the many properties in the area to get away from that 164-meter above datum. And so that's the key element. We think we brought a thoughtful and considered approach to this. Our development proposal would mean that the occupied portion of the dwelling is above the 200-year flood zone, and the portion underneath that would be constructed of pressure treated and basically waterproof materials, concrete, et cetera. So that's all the time you're going to give me. That's all I have to say. I know that there's at least one other neighbor who's come all the way from out of town to support this. He may want to say something, but there we go.
Thank you very much.
I'll be here later for questions.
Is there anyone else who would like to provide input to committee on items on today's agenda? Please come forward. There's a red light around the top of the microphone that should come on. There you go.
Hi, my name is Sean Moore. I am neighbors with Norman Terry, and I support this board variance permit that he's looking for. I live across the street. We have the same basic issues. So I believe that Norm stepping forward with this forward thinking is a great plan. And I've submitted some information to the board, I think, that was sent, I believe. And that's my support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that would like to come forward and provide input to committee today on items on our agenda? Seeing none, I think we'll proceed to the next item, but just before we go there, I would just like to turn to staff and find out if there is going to be a conclusion to the adjustments that are being made. It's kind of distracting to the committee to have the work being done over there. Is it nearing conclusion? Because if it is, I'll call for a short break until it's done. So for those of you there, we're not, we are streaming. We are live streaming, but we're trying to fix an issue over here. I would ask if is everyone comfortable with proceeding? Just speak up so that everyone is able to be heard, and we'll go to the next item. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item on the agenda is correspondence, item C1. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid Electoral Area B, Shawnigan Lake, in the amount of $1,000 be provided to Cobble Hill Event Society to support music in the park in Cobble Hill.
Turn to the director for the area. Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Smith. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? Not opposed, the motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C2, the recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area B, Shawnigan Lake, in the amount of $1,000 be provided to Cowichan Secondary School for two $500 bursaries for graduating students for residing in electoral area B, Shawnigan Lake.
Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C3 is a grant and aid request, and the recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area B, Shawnigan Lake, in the amount of $1,000 be provided to Francis Kelsey Secondary School for two $500 bursaries for graduating students residing in electoral area B, Shawnigan Lake.
Moved by Director Smith, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C4 is a grant and aid request. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area B, Shawnigan Lake, in the amount of $1,000 be provided to Francis Kelsey Secondary School to support the 2020 Dry Grad celebration.
Moved by Director Yanni DiNardo, seconded by Director Smith. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C5 is a grant and aid request. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area C, Cobble Hill, in the amount of $500 be provided to Cobble Hill Event Society to assist with events organized by the society in the Cobble Hill area.
Moved by Director Wilson, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion? Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a very quick word of explanation on the amount here. This was my original amount was to CHES for $1,000 for music in the park, and I'd like to thank Area B for coming up and supporting that as well. It's a very good thing. The reason why I cut that back and was because I had this second one. So basically what I've done is given $500 for music in the park and $500 for other events which CHES organises, such as the children's films, etc. So the total to CHES does come to $1,000. It's just a little bit split up, and I thought it would be useful to just explain that.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C6 is a grant and aid request. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area C, Cobble Hill, in the amount of $500 be provided to Duncan Cowichan Chamber of Commerce to support the year-round visitor servicing operations of the Cowichan Regional Visitor Center and tourism, business, and attractions in Area C.
Moved by Director Wilson, seconded by Director Kuhn. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C7 is a grant and aid request. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area G, Saltaire Gulf Islands, in the amount of $500 be provided to Nanaimo Ladysmith Schools Foundation for a bursary for a graduating student residing in Saltaire.
Moved by Director Smith, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item C8 is a grant and aid request. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid electoral area G, Saltaire Gulf Islands, in the amount of $500 be provided to Chemainus Secondary School for a bursary for a graduating student residing in Saltaire.
Moved by Director Smith, seconded by Director Wilson. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. That concludes that section, I believe. On to item 7, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item 7 is information. And there's one information item before you, which is the Electoral Area B Shawnigan Lake Advisory Planning Commission minutes of December 12th, 2019, for information.
Any comment or discussion? Director Acton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'd just like, I know they kind of say what happened there. I'd just like to point out that the process that the commission or the APCs have been subject to, in this case, in our case, Area B, it was such a huge job that was put onto them that it's really unfortunate that our chair, after 14 years, has resigned. And the whole APC, and there is a motion there that they're asking for the ability to give feedback on kind of the feeling of the meeting, and there is a comment there that they don't feel valued. So I think there was a time when we were really adamant that the APC stick to the motion of what they were looking at, and to not, there were maybe some instances where the APC got deep in the weeds of too much information presented back on their meetings, but it appears like now we're asking for too little. They'd just like to be able to have that opportunity to provide a little bit more. So a little comment area on the actual format of the meeting that they're given.
Thank you.
So I'd like to hear from staff if there is consideration, or has it just been overlooked? Do we have a section where they can give some more input, just notes
Well,
or thinking? Because they don't have the support of staff at these meetings. It's kind of challenging sometimes.
so we do have a broader question coming forward, which I hope will be considered sometime in the near future when we meet to discuss strategic planning. I read the minutes with interest and found that there is obviously a need for clarification, because my understanding of the APC policies are that they absolutely have the right to not only say yay or nay to an application, but have the ability to comment and make recommendations within the realm of the report that's before them. There seems to be some need for clarification as to exactly what their role and what's expected of them. And so I think that clarification is something that the staff should be looking at. But I think that everybody understanding what the role and responsibilities are and what their comments, what comments are expected of them is important for everyone to be clear on. So, Ms. Chirolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, yes, just to say briefly, the APC does have the ability to include some bullet points to accompany the recommendations that they make within their minutes. And so I think it's probably more of a staff support to APC would be helpful to that. They had orientation last April, and we probably would be due for another sort of training session with them. We can do that at that time.
Thank you very much. Next item, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item on the agenda under reports is a report from the Development Services Division regarding application numbers DP 19D02 and DVP 19D04 for PID 023-826-291, development permit application and development variance permit application for 5255 Chester Road. There are two options, and staff are recommending option 1.
Ms. Wright, welcome.
Good afternoon. So I'm here to present for 5255 Chester Road. It's the site of the Couch and Valley Brewing Company. So just a little rehash of what we've done this year. On February 26, 2020, the board voted in favor of issuing a temporary use permit for an existing storage container on the northeast side of the property, which is right here, kind of where I'm oh wait, I think I thought in advance. There's an orange circle around it. So the existing building on the site was built in approximately 1998, and it is now used as a brewery and a tasting room and dining area. The development permit proposes to add an additional 45 square meters, oh, wrong one, in the red circle there, which is 485 square feet, addition to the southeast corner of the existing building. As the building was built prior to the adoption of the current zoning bylaw, the landscape requirements are not able to meet the specifications outlined in the bylaw. An existing drive aisle around here runs along the east portion of the lot in the rear of the building adjacent to the east side lot line, and is used for delivery trucks and work-related vehicles. So due to the location of the existing building and the applicant's desire to keep delivery trucks out of the customer parking area, which is over here in the middle of the lot, as well as the drive aisle cannot be narrowed to permit the required landscape buffer. So variance is required on the east side yard landscape buffer from 1.5 to 0 meters. So in terms of the development permit, the applicants are proposing a 2-story addition, which is right over here, which will include expanded kitchen and washroom facilities on the 1st story and office space on the 2nd. The exterior finishings include galvanized metal siding with wood fascia detailing at the roof line. The existing patio area, which right now goes to about the trunk of the tree here, will be expanded this way to include the area around the mature existing maple tree. The patio will be finished with the permeable pavers to match the existing stonework, and a new black metal fence will be installed around the seating and main entrance area. The parking lot will be formalized to include the required number of parking stalls, as well as to designate an accessible person's stall. There's also bicycle parking proposed adjacent to the front entrance. The application was referred to the Area D APC in September of 2019. The APC was supportive of the proposal and made no recommendations. There was also notification for the development variance permit, where 15 letters were mailed or hand-delivered to surrounding owners and occupants. As of today, we have not received any replies. As such, the proposal does meet the intent of the development permit area guidelines, and it's recommended for approval subject to the requirements in the development permit and development variance permit.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. I will go to directors to see if there's any questions in regards to this file. None at this point. Director Yanni DiNardo, would you like to make a
I'd
recommendation?
gladly like to make a recommendation. I move this recommendation.
Moved and seconded. Would you read the recommendation, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board, number 1, the development variance permit number DVP 19D04 for parcel identifier 023826291 to vary section 2.31A of CVRD Electoral Area D Couch and Bay zoning bylaw number 3705 from 1.5 meters to 0 meters be issued, and number 2, that development permit application DP 19D02 for parcel identifier 023826291 be issued.
Seeing no other hands, call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries, and that will go to our March 11th board meeting. Thank you. No? Yes? Yes? Seeing general nodding around the table. Excellent. Next item, I see Mr. Limshu coming to the lectern, so Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R2 is a report from the Development Service Division regarding application number DP 18A04 for 850 Trans-Canada Highway. There are 2 options, and staff are recommending option number 1.
Mr. Limshu, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is the microphone on?
Yeah, I'm just soft-spoken, I guess. I'll speak up. It is. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the application before the committee relates to application number DP 18A04. It's a development permit application, and it relates to a proposed subdivision along 850 Trans-Canada Highway. The applicant is proposing to basically create 4 new lots. The parcel is zoned rural residential 2. The minimum parcel size is 2 hectares. The proposed subdivision, each of the lots meet that minimum requirement. The site is actually located and subject to the South Cowichan Rural DPA, hence the requirement for the development permit. The development permit covers landscaping, rainwater management, environmental protection, and riparian protection. And within the staff report, we've noted the number of studies that have been provided. So restoration plan for removing invasive species. There was a geotech assessment related to rainwater management and landscaping, as well as an RAR report submitted for the protection around the creek associated with proposed Lot 4. The recommendations put forward within each of the studies have been incorporated into the development permit. And the expectation is that the applicant, in moving forward, will comply with the recommendations of the consultants. Any questions?
Question for staff? No? Director Nicholson?
So there are no requirements about the view corridor along the Malahat?
Mr. Limshu?
Not in this case. So while the address is actually 850 Trans-Canada, you'll notice on the proposed subdivision plan that Abador Lane is extended to service each of the proposed lots. And in fact, Abador Lane will become the new frontage road, if you will, for the proposed lots.
Director, do you have a follow-up?
So that means there's nothing to ensure that trees remain along the view corridor there?
Mr. Limshu?
There are, within the development permit guidelines, there is notation, there is some wording with respect to protecting the corridor along the highway. And in fact, this probably gets into sort of the next item on the agenda, and it's related to the covenants that have been registered on title. So at the time, there were a number of covenants registered way back a number of years ago. But one of the covenants, and it's the one that's not being considered today, relates to easement areas, basically in the location of where the Abador Lane is proposed. So if you can take a look at the screen and you see where my mouse, this is the covenant line, if you will. And within there, the covenant basically speaks to no removal of trees or vegetation without the permission of the regional district. So that covenant will remain on title, and certainly we will be working with the applicant moving forward. The long and short of it is, should the subdivision be approved, the applicant will be looking to provide some access into the site to service the future single-family dwellings.
Thank you. Director Smith?
Yes, thank you very much. I was noticing in the report, it says that...
Could you speak into your microphone, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
I apologize. The report also suggests on-site stormwater disposal systems may be appropriate where necessary and should be suitably designed for each lot. Is that happening along with this application, or is it someplace else?
Mr. Limshu?
The on-water stormwater disposal will be dealt with basically at the building permit stage. For lack of a better term, the proposed systems will effectively be rock pits for each of the dwelling, because typically that's what you will use, given the size of the property, given the type of end use that we are looking at here, where it is single-family dwelling. The applicant is here, and they could probably speak more to the detailed design of it.
Director Smith, follow-up?
Thank you very much. So as we move through climate change, I'm just wondering if there's an encouragement from the CBRD to look at cisterns that the stormwater is retained in and then being able to be used on the properties later. Are we looking at that type of situation here?
Mr. Limshu?
In this particular case, we are not. Discussion has been simply around how to deal with the stormwater that comes off the roof. But certainly if, moving forward, we can review policies and guidelines related to that.
Yeah, I would remind everyone there's a development permit, and it's in regards to meeting the requirements of the development permit in the OCP. And I turn to Director Kuhn. Were you going to move the recommendation? And
I move
seconded
option
by-
number 1.
Seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo, and turn to Ms. Harrison to read option number 1, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that development permit number DP 18A04 for parcel identifier 006987885 be issued.
Seeing no other hands, call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. I believe R3 is next. Mr. Limshu, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R3 is a report from the Development Services Division regarding application number 03A16 COV, covenant release application for 850 Trans-Canada Highway. There are 2 options in the report, and staff are recommending option 1.
Mr. Limshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The request to release covenant relates to the same property, 850 Trans-Canada Highway. The covenant in question, so that's S30678, was registered on title back in 1987. And so at the time, this particular parcel was part of a larger parent parcel. And so the covenant was registered at that time to protect, effectively to protect the setback for Spectacle Creek. Over the years, the parent parcel, the larger parcel, subdivided, but the covenants transferred with the new titles. As a requirement of the subdivision, the Ministry of Transportation has requested that the applicant remove redundant covenants. And in this case, given that the parcel is here, Spectacle Creek is approximately 2 kilometers away, it doesn't make sense to have this particular covenant still remain on title. Any questions?
Do we have any questions for staff? We have no questions for staff. Moved by Director Kuhn, seconded by Director Nicholson. Any discussion on this item? Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that covenant number COV S30678, registered on the title for 850 Canada Highway for parcel identifier 006987885 be discharged.
Seeing no other hands, call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Item number 2 was pulled. So next item is R3. It's Mr. Limshu, Ms. Harrison. R4, sorry. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R4 is the report from Development Services Division regarding application number DP 19I02 and DVP 20I02 for identifier 003046257 for Lot 3, Perry Road. There are 2 options, and staff is recommending option 1.
Mr. Limshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in this, in the staff report, we're basically dealing with 2 applications. One application relates to the development permit 19I02, and the other application relates to the development variance permit 20I02, and it relates to the same property. In fact, Mr. Macy, I think, has stolen most of my thunder with respect to the report. But just to hit the highlights, the property is subject to the development permit because it falls within the watercourse protection area. And I think, this particular slide illustrates what the owners are trying to do. So on the left, you'll see what currently exists. There's basically a roof over an existing fifth wheel that's been there for the better part of 30 years, plus or minus. What they'd like to do is replace that with a new cottage. The proposed location is in the same spot, so effectively they're replacing the old with the new. A couple things that they have to take into consideration is the fact of the the high water mark. So on the diagram to the right, and it doesn't show up quite well, but it's highlighted in yellow. The 164 meter high water mark is delineated. The proposed location and existing location, you can see that there's the existing structure is more than 30 meters away from the what is considered the natural boundary most of the year. However, our bylaws do not take the measurement from the natural boundary. It starts at the 164 mark. And so when you look at the proposed variance, you know, relaxing the setback from 15 meters to 0, it seems extreme. But when you look at the application in the context of what currently exists, it makes sense. As Mr. Marcy has indicated, they've been extremely sensitive to the redevelopment of the site. The proposed building is at or above the high water mark of 164 meters. The other elevation that they have to take into account is the 200-year flood elevation. And so all the habitable space, that being the second story and above, will be above that 200-year flood elevation. Mr. Marcy also indicated that they are looking at effectively a sand-mounted package treatment septic system, and that system will be located between the proposed building site and the road, which is further up from the lake. You know, in terms of quality of effluent that package treatment puts out, it's substantially better than a conventional septic system. Any questions related to this?
Turn to directors. Any questions? Director Nicholson.
So just on this topic of the septic field, it's within the 200-year flood area, is that what I understand?
Mr. Lim Chu.
That's correct. So it'll be above the high water mark, below the 200-year flood. The system, it's basically and correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically a self-contained unit. So all the treatments contained within the unit, and then all that comes out of it is really high-quality treated water, which is discharged into a sand-mounted field.
So,
Follow up?
so if I, can I assume that if there was a 200-year flood, would there be much discharge into the, do you think?
Mr. Lim Chu.
Given the quality of the discharge, it would be almost, and I'm not an engineer, so I'm going to preface that. It'll be almost like drinking water quality because of the treatment level that's being proposed.
Final follow-up?
Okay, so I guess my question would be, are there septic packages that we should require in flood-prone areas where there is development that otherwise shouldn't be there? And would this be one of them?
Now, at this point, I'm not qualified to comment on that, but certainly, moving forward, it is something that we can certainly investigate, given the sensitivity of the area. All I can say is based on, I know about this particular system, it is far better than your typical septic system.
Remind directors that this is in regards to a siting and development permit for very specific items, and I'll go to Director Acton next.
My question, so if I was looking at this with the perspective of Area B, I would be looking at it, trying to see, so when we have cottages that are rebuilt and development happens, there's an opportunity to make things better than they were.
Right.
And so I'm hoping that you could actually point those out a little clearer for me, because I don't see a big improvement for the community or the water quality moving forward in the future. So And I think these are great opportunities that we get to replace septic systems and the like, so.
Mr. Limshaw, I'm going to take
that's
this one.
My lens.
This is a very long-standing, very complicated issue that has been dealt with at the community, at the staff level, over a number of years with not yet a satisfactory outcome. And Director Kuhn is well-versed in this, and that I look at what is being proposed here as almost a standard that we would hope that others might aspire to for this area. It's an incredibly challenging and difficult place for this sort of activity to take place. And I don't know that this scenario and this site can be related to any other jurisdiction just simply because of it's a historic subdivision that has been approved prior to the regional district, and we're stuck with pre-created lots that have limited or no use under our current regulations, so that what is being proposed here is actually a far cry and improvement over the scenario that we face right now. Is that a fair assessment, Mr. Limshaw?
I would concur with that assessment. I think given the existing circumstances that we're dealing with and the constraints of the property, the proposed development is far better than what currently exists. You know, is it 100% bulletproof? No, but I would argue that it is making the current situation better, given the proposed design, not only of the building, but also of the way they're treating their sewage. They have been, and they continue to be very responsible with respect to how they treat their property and been respectful of the lake. I've been out to the site and I've seen the improvements that they've made in terms of the vegetation along the foreshore.
Director Smith.
Thank you. Through to staff, can you just go back to the photo of the, so you're saying it's an RV under a roof in that one photo?
Currently, so you can see in the picture to the left, the camper, and it's basically under a roof structure for protection. The overall footprint of the proposed building is not much bigger than what you currently see there. So again, it comes back to the fact that they're very environmentally conscious and wanting to preserve and protect the natural habitat on the site.
Do you have
So
a follow-up?
Yes, technically, there is no real structure that's actually there. It's an RV, and that has the canopy over top of it been there for 30 years? That it's not really replacing a structure, because an RV is not a structure. So I'm a little confused how we're replacing an RV with an actual structure if there wasn't
Mr.
a
Limshaw?
real building there.
Well, I would suggest that the structure is the roof cover and the deck around it, and you know that footprint's been there. Yeah, I mean technically the RV you could pull it out of there, but the owners have built around it over the years.
I'll go to Director Wilson, then Nicholson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't see a problem with this application whatsoever. It's already been pointed out that it's a vast improvement of what is already there. It's also a vast improvement over the systems, the treatment system, which are in place as well. And some of the things, I'm sorry, have been brought up are kind of splitting hairs as far as I'm concerned. This one I will support fully.
Thank you, Director Wilson. Director Nicholson.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it's an improvement. It's great that the applicants have taken the initiative to try and improve the situation. But my position is that there's more than this particular lot that's difficult in this particular area, and we have been concerned about septic issues around the lake for a long time, and we know that the 200-year flood is probably going to become more frequent than 200 years. So we do need to be concerned about the technology that we allow when we're doing these buildings. So after we've dealt with this application, I would like to maybe make a request of staff.
Director Kuhn?
Some of us might remember, I think it was about 6 years ago or so, there was an application on one of the islands off Bald Mountain, it's Goat Island. And there was a septic system, a treatment system installed that cost $35,000.
Director Kuhn, is this a question for staff or a comment?
No, and it satisfied all the requirements, and it works beautifully. And I understand that's the same system that the applicant has installed. So I have no problem with that, and I would like to move to option number 1.
Option 1's been moved, seconded by Director Acton. And Ms. Harrison, would you read that recommendation, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendations before you is that it be recommended to the board. Number 1, that development variance permit application number DVP 20I02 for PID 003046257 to vary section 3.20 of CVRD Electoral Area I, Ubo-Mead Creek zoning bylaw number 2465 to reduce the setback from a watercourse for the construction of a single residential dwelling from 15 meters to 0 meters be issued. And number 2, that development permit application number DP 19I02 excuse me, for PID 003046257 be issued.
Seeing no other hands, call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Director Nicholson.
Right, so maybe through you to staff, would it be possible for you to do some work on bring back best practices on dealing with sites like this on the flood thing? Because it would be useful, I think, to understand from an engineering point of view what the risks are and if there are particular technologies that we should be requiring on these types of sites. I think it would be useful to put that into policy.
So I think for the purpose of this specific site that it would be appropriate if we could ask staff to locate the volumes of work that was done on this. I recall Mr. Conway spent an awful lot of his lifetime working on this. So if we could have those brought forward and so that the committee could review all of the work that was done on this and perhaps we might want to consider some general broader policies, but I don't know that developing a specific policy for this this site is appropriate. I think that there is this has been studied to a high degree, and we can look at other policies. But I think having the information about what was presented before and what's been researched before would be helpful to all the directors, because we will likely see more applications come forward at some point. So, staff, are you clear on what Director Nicholson has asked for? Ms. Sherrill?
Thank you very much. I think that, Mr. Chair, that the topic is an interesting one and would be good for discussion during the modernized OCP process. But in addition to that, it's important to recognize that we do work in a professional reliance model, and part of that model involves deferring to professionals on on-site wastewater management, and that happens at the building permit stage. We also need to be cognizant of the fact that we're working in areas of concurrent jurisdiction with the province on environmental management, and we want to be cautious about not infringing on what might be provincial responsibilities.
Director Nicholson, you had further comment?
Yeah, I don't think that the way you framed what I had asked was exactly what I was getting at. My point is that in this particular case, we were lucky. We had an applicant that has stepped up to the plate, but we can't always rely on that happening. And so it would be to the community's best interest to have guidelines in place for when we have to approve site development on sites that normally should not be developed. And in particular, I think that if Mr. Limshu is not an engineer and can't confirm to me the adequacy of this particular septic plant system, it would be prudent for all of us to have an understanding of what ones are and aren't, you know, what we should be requiring. And all I'm asking is for some report coming back on sort of the minimum requirements when we have to permit development on difficult sites that are flood prone.
Director Acton? Director Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm not an engineer either, but as far as I know, every single one of these systems has been approved by the Vancouver Island Health Authority and the various other engineering authorities that know what they're talking about. So really bringing forward more reports for us to read is flying in the face of what the expert already knows.
Director Kuhn?
Yeah, I don't feel a report is necessary on this. This thing has been studied to death. And one has to remember also, not all the properties are the same. So for us to come out with some kind of policy or whatever would be the wrong thing, because I don't know how many of them are actually going to apply to have a structure built. The majority of them are occupied by removable trailers. So if an application comes forward, it'll have to stand on its own, and we'll have to deal with it individually. You can't generalize this whole thing. This area is too difficult to generalize. And I'm personally, quite frankly, I would be dead against getting another study done on it, which we already did, so many of them. The problem is not going to go away. It's going to stay there, and we have to deal with them individually as they come. And I'm also against constantly trying to outguess the environmental consultants. We have them, we hire them to do a job. Now for us to go and judge now and say, well, this is really not right what he did, who are we to tell them that maybe they haven't done the right job? That's what they're there for. So let's rely on them.
And I just want to clarify my comments in regards to this item is that there is a body of work, a thorough body of work that's been done on this item, and that I would suggest directors read that body of work before we weigh into further study of this. As Director Kuhn has stated, that they will be individual and unique circumstances if further applications come forward, and we will likely have to deal with them on that basis. Director Acton.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. So could we have that information on the next, provided as information on the next agenda? So I'm going to find a whole bunch of reports somewhere.
Director Acton, I'll get that information for
system?
you and everyone else so that it's made available and everybody can have a good long read.
Perfect.
Any other discussion on this item? Go to the next item, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item, R5, is a report from the Parks and Trails Division. And it's regarding the cancellation of a Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure issued permit to construct for an unused public trail in Belvedere Crescent right-of-way in Electoral Area E. And there is a recommendation before you.
Who from Parks is going to be coming up and introducing this? Mr. Dias, are you going to be speaking to this, or are you representing?
Mr. Chair, I'm here on behalf of Tanya Soroka, and there is a recommendation before committee. I'm obviously here to answer any questions if there is any at this time.
Any questions for staff? Seeing none, turn to the director for the area.
I'd like to move the recommendation and speak to it.
Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Wilson. Director Nicholson, floor is yours.
So we did some community consultation on this particular trail. It is used by local residents, but it's not heavily used because the subdivision it is located in is not fully built out. And there are, I believe, other priorities for community parks budget at this time. So we would like to postpone further investment in this trail until a future date.
Thank you. It's been duly moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed, the motion carries. That too will go to the board meeting on the 11th. Ms. Harrison, next item, R6. Ms. I'm having enough trouble as it is. Ms. Breen, I believe you're up. No?
Mr. Chair,
Oh, it is
item
for information.
R6 is the report from Community Planning Division regarding the electoral area open house report to the community, and that is there for community's information.
Maybe I was assuming that this committee would have questions. Ms. Yanni DiNardo, Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Ms. Preen. I'd just like to thank the staff. I had the opportunity to go to the Kerry Park presentation, and I really liked the effort that was put into staff to every detail. I'm a detail person, from the movie theater to the popcorn to everything else. I just wanted to say that they did an amazing job, and we're very unique and thought of every little detail, and I wanted to say thank you. We appreciated it. Thank you.
Yeah. Excellent. Director Kuhn, and followed by Smith.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on that as well. I attended all of the sessions, and I was impressed with the work they put in there and the way they presented themselves. I think staff did an excellent job. Thank you very much.
Director Smith.
So I'll be third in line and say exactly the same, that, so many people attended out area G and H area. We win the prize for getting people out and supporting their open house, and we really appreciated them coming all the way to the north, area G and H. So just watching the staff answering all the questions and working with the public was amazing, and I really appreciated it, and I had a lot of amazing comments back, so just want you to know that.
And I'm going to jump on the bandwagon as well, and just make a note that they were, for the most part, very well attended, and staff were very professional in the way they conducted themselves. I think there was a lot of great information obtained from that, and just want to note that they're pretty good at making lemonade out of lemons, because in the one area where unfortunately the bulk mailing didn't happen exactly as it should have, there was some quick movement, and notices were sent out via, I guess, first-class mail to residents. And as it turned out, I think it was in North Oyster, a resident came up and said, "This isn't appropriate that we would be getting a letter in the mail a day or two before the event." But that tells me that it actually worked, because she was out at the event. So it was very well attended, and I think that your staff did a fantastic job. So with that, any other comments, questions? It's for information. Next item. Thank you very much. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item, R7, is a report and PowerPoint presentation from Economic Development Division regarding Shawnigan Lake Village Plan and charrette implementation. This item was referred from the February 26, 2020 Regional Services Committee, and there is one recommendation.
And I think Ms. Charolf is taking this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a minor correction. The reports from the Land Use Services Department, from the General Manager, rather than from the Economic Development Division, because we're at Electoral Area Services and not Regional Services. Subsequent to the report being withdrawn from the Regional Services Committee agenda, it was redrafted, and the recommendation before you is that essentially the charrette report coming out of the Shawnigan Lake Village process, in addition to the charrette reports coming out of the Cobble Hill and Cowichan Bay processes, be referred back to staff for consideration during the modernized OCP process and Parks and Infrastructure Planning. And another note, the PowerPoint presentation that was to accompany the report was in fact provided to the Regional Services Committee.
Director Acton.
You can read my mind now.
Minds.
It's creepy. I have two things right at the moment. That statement about parks in the motion, would they also be looking at things? So as far as Area B, we would like to understand if the park items could be adopted by our Parks and Trails Master Plan, because it has gone through so much public consultation. It's gone through even more than our Parks Master Plan went through. So we'd like to be able to have it as like a supplemental or with that lens at least looked at. Because our Parks Master Plan is coming to near an end, and we've been having that discussion already. How do we, what should we be adding to it, and what should we be looking at for more parks items for Area B?
Ms. Trill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there are some implications for parks, both for Shawnigan Lake, but for the region generally. You'll note in the report there's reference to the potential for some commercial uses within parks. That would require an amendment to the parks bylaw, which would affect all electoral areas essentially. So that issue could be dealt with separately. The issues around parks in Shawnigan Lake, in my view, could be referred to your Parks Commission for consideration and contemplation around incorporation of the recommendations of the Shawnigan Lake Village Plan into the Parks and Trails Master Plan, and to inform potential budget discussions going forward.
Okay, we could go that way. I just thought maybe that was stepping backwards a little bit, since the community has already given so much consultation that we aren't sending it to the Parks Commission for consult. You know, for the ideas, ideas are embraced by the community already. So do you, we should still do that?
Well, just before
That's
you,
your-
before you jump in, Ms. Trill, if I, just looking at the recommendation, and I think that Director Acton's being very clear about the path that she would like this to go, and it makes a whole bunch of sense to me, and I think the resolution is pretty good at covering in that it's for parks and infrastructure planning. So it's not just the HOCP and the modernized OCP, but I think looking at the park staff representing here, that it's clear that this be broader and be taken into account for that. So Ms. Harrison, is there any additional wording that needs to attach? There isn't. So Director
Okay.
Acton, next item.
So I'm satisfied with that.
She's still
Also, in the report at the end, there's some general manager comments, and economic development was looking for this, as well as they're looking for a board resolution as to how much they can continue to support the South in these initiatives with an economic perspective. So how can we move forward on those type of comments that are right at the bottom?
Ms. Trill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there certainly are some potential implications for CBRD economic development coming out of the report, and my recommendation would be that discussions about allocation of economic development couch and staff resources be had at a committee of all regional directors.
So do I need to refer that section to regional services?
Would defer to the Deputy Corporate
Well,
Secretary.
Yeah, I would look to Ms. Harrison and suggest that I think it's pretty clear that should be an item that would show up on a regional services agenda sometime soon. Do you need specific direction for that to happen? Ms. Harrison?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, instead of pulling something out of a staff report, an actual report should be going to committee. So yes. You're talking about pulling comments out of a report?
No, I think it's
You want-
more a discussion has to be had at regional services about allocation of economic development, Cowichan resources.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that would necessitate a more formal presentation of an idea at the committee level, so.
Ms. Terrell?
So I believe one option would be notice of motion from a director to have that discussion at committee. Yes?
Ms. Harrison, does that make sense? Makes sense to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Notice of motion, no. What would be better would be actually something concrete that we could put on a committee agenda that everybody could review. So I would refer this to economic development staff to come up with something that they would like to present at committee.
Go ahead, Director Acton.
Well, I think that this started off from economic development, so they've already done that, and they initially started at regional services. So just that component, could it not just be a notice to go back for discussion at regional services? So that we,
Ms. Terrell?
there's a disconnect here.
Yeah, so
No?
there was originally a report that went to regional services that was pulled off. So I think the question is, can this committee refer to another committee, or should be a report coming from staff? Right, so referral would be back to staff.
Okay, so this is the original report, and it will be in the minutes of the regional services. Can we just pull it out of the minutes and then have that discussion?
Well, I'm going to weigh in here in that, it was never this complicated before. Usually staff could pick up on what we were laying down. We have a recommendation to refer this back to staff. I would think that staff could pick up on what we're saying and their report come forward to regional services without a formal motion from this committee. Is there a reason why that can't happen?
Mr. Chair, the recommendation in the staff report was referral back to staff on electoral area matters, not on regional matters.
Director Acton.
Can I refer, after we've dealt with the motion on the floor, I don't even know if it's on the floor actually, but when it gets on the floor, can I refer this report back to economic development for them to present to the regional services?
Sure. Director Nicholson.
So it seems to me that this issue of food trucks and farmers markets and things in parks is an economic development issue as well, in part. And I think it would be interesting when it comes back that we try and think about this outside of our silos of parks and, try and have an integrated discussion about that. So it might require a little bit of work to do that when it comes back to regional services.
Thank you. So we have a resolution that's before us. Would you like to, Director, sorry, you were on the list. Director Smith.
Thank you. I've been following the Harmonized Official Community Plan quite thoroughly, and my question is do these fit under the local area plans, because they're specific to Shawnigan Lake, Cobble Hill Village, and Cowichan Bay, and they don't necessarily relate to all 9 electoral areas? So are we looking at this to fit these to be somehow under local area plans? Can maybe
Ms. Terrell?
If I could defer to Coralie Breen on that question, she could speak to how that information could be incorporated into the modernized OCP.
Ms. Breen?
Through the chair. We have addressed in the harmonized OCP D piece the 3 charrettes, so they've been itemized that they will be considered with any appropriate application going forward. That's if the HOCP is adopted. And they will be considered in the modernization as well in terms of some of the issues that will relate to designation changes. And we'll be looking at the recommended designation changes in tandem with servicing capacity, which doesn't directly correspond to your question. So they'll be considered in the DPs, which will be regional in terms of application of some things could extend beyond the scope of Shawnigan or Cobble Hill or Cowichan Bay in design guidelines.
Oh, follow-up?
So part of it, though, will have to go into their local area plan of what's going on with the charrettes.
Correct.
Because it's specific
It's specific to the
that.
local area plan, and some of it could be considered in the broader scope of the form and character guidelines going forward.
So I don't know that we've had this, oh, yes, please.
Thank you for your indulgence. I, know how far along you are in the modernization, and were you expecting this amount of additional workload that's going to be put in there on this? Is there capacity to fit all of this into your busy work schedule? Because we all know you're overworked on
Ms. Breen?
this.
Through the chair. Staff were very aware of all three, the previous ones that Cowichan Bay and Cobble Hill were very aware of, I think, Shawnigan coming through, so it's been considered in terms of overall workload, yes.
Director Acton, would you like to move the recommendation? Seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed, motion carries. And I think it's time for a short. Apparently, Ms. Harrison says we should have a specific motion that this be referred for a staff report to go to regional services, correct? Ms. Harrison?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, staff can be contacted to bring something forward, but it needs to be in a formal, we can't just take comments from one report and refer those comments to another committee.
Right.
It would be staff coming forward with a report on those comments.
So
If you'd
I'll
like
move
to
that.
formalize that, that would be fine.
Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Everybody knows what we're doing with this resolution? Great. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Now let's take a short break. Okay, let's get back down to business, everybody. I'm told Mr. DeJong is here. Director Yanni
I
DiNardo?
just wanted to move the recommendation.
Okay, seconded by Director Smith. Any questions for staff? Ms. Harrison, read the recommendation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation before you is, it's from the report R8, and there are 4 parts to it. The recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that the 2020 budget for Function 350 North Oyster Volunteer Fire Department be amended to 1, reduce transfer to reserve by $80,136, 2, increase transfer from capital reserve by $21,314, 3, increase transfer from operating reserve by $5,550. And 4, increase vehicle expense by $107,000.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. That motion carries. That'll go to the board next Wednesday. R9, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R9 is a report from the Inspections and Enforcement Division regarding a temporary change to a liquor license for 5039 Marshall Road, and there is a recommendation before you.
Turn to the director for the area. Move the recommendation, Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Wilson. Read the recommendation, please, Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch be advised that the Cowichan Valley Regional District has no objection to the proposed temporary changes to existing liquor license for events taking place in 2020 on June 13th, July 18th, August 1st, August 2nd, August 22nd, and August 23rd at Venata, is that it? I can't pronounce that. Zanata Limited Winery located at 5039 Marshall Road, Glenora in Area E for liquor license number 171424.
Call a question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? None opposed. The motion carries. So we have a bunch of for information items coming up. So, Ms. Harrison, R10 is next. I guess I should pose, does any of the committee have questions on any of the upcoming items? We have a series of year-end and month-end reports. Do we have a yes? Okay, so let's move through R10. First is for information. Bylaw enforcement, is that the item that you'd like to pose a question to, Director Acton? So, who's presenting or who's representing on behalf of inspection and enforcement? Mr. Morano. So, do you have a presentation or any comments you'd like to make?
Just in short, the most significant change last year in enforcement inspections was the adoption of the soil deposit bylaw and some shifts from noise and OCP related issues to parks and zoning, but otherwise the year was a pretty standard year.
Thank you, Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions. One around the soil deposit bylaw. I guess in area B, A and B, we're concerned of runoff into creeks and eventually making its way high nitrogen into the lake, adding to our milfoil issues. Is there anything being done to kind of testing or like to ensure that this new soil bylaw is actually effective in preventing some of that?
Go ahead.
Thank you. We are monitoring all the soil that's being deposited on the sites. The bylaw has applications in place, have environmental monitoring provided by professionals. The environmental models identify, requirements to prevent material from entering the water courses into the lake. So we're relying on the professional models and the fact that the deposit sites are following their requirements by the professionals to keep any extra material from entering the water courses and going into any of the areas.
Follow up?
Sure, thank you. I guess around the soil bylaw, are we seeing that its purpose is effective? That we created this bylaw to kind of to regulate and to control and hopefully slow down the pace of soil dumping that was being done without any kind of oversight. Like, how do we know that we're in a better place now than we were before the bylaw?
Mr. Warwick.
So I would say that the pace of unmonitored soil is drastically lowered because we are monitoring all major sites. Even sites that do not require type A and B permits yet, I'm going out and monitoring many of these sites to make sure that they're complying with the aspects of the bylaw, whether it be through a permit of a type C or just generally complying with the regulations similar to a type A permit or A and B permits, which will be coming in on June the 1st of this year. Just an example of what's happening, the soil sites that we are monitoring, we've had no complaints coming on to do with the large rain. There was no instances of people commenting on sloughing or any such thing going into the water courses, which I think is a good sign because of things that have happened in the past, that we are able to make sure that deposited soil is being done in an appropriate manner that's protecting the environment.
Fire away. I got one too.
Thank you. I guess I'm curious, this might not be a question for you two gentlemen, thank you for being here, by the way. Have we ever done like a review of bylaw? Do we understand that it's actually effective and like, could we be doing better? I don't know that the perception in the community of enforcement, it's still the perception that we're the Wild West and you can get away with whatever you want.
Mr. McDonald.
To you, Mr. Chair. In taking the role on, I was looking through some old files and I did discover that some predecessors had started such a report. It's one that I will take up in the near future. To date, what I've seen since I've been doing the role is that I feel bylaw has been very successful. A lot of what we don't hear is the success stories that we have. Usually we just hear a lot of complaints, and being complaint driven, I guess that's where we get to. But to say what I've seen in the last year and a half is it's been quite amazing what the whole staff and the team have done.
Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to draw attention to the committee as well that we have limited jurisdiction. And similar to our waste stream management licensing bylaw, where we've imposed management prescriptions over our waste and composting facilities, the soils bylaws are very much like that in terms of we prescribe how those facilities will be managed with the intent and purpose of trying to prevent and mitigate environmental damage. At the end of the day, it is not the CBRD's responsibility or role to enforce environmental pollution. That is the Ministry of Environment or Environment Canada or Department of Fisheries and Oceans that address those matters. And I think sometimes it's a matter of expectations that the public believe that because we have a bylaw in place that we are from source to pollution required and expected to enforce those. We don't have the ability or the authority to enforce pollution. And so we work hand in glove with those other agencies. We do our part to try and mitigate those effects on the ground through management practices, but at the end of the day, the polluter pays. And if one of those facilities, whether it's a soil facility or composting facility, pollutes the environment as a result of their operations, that is the provincial or federal government's responsibility to enforce those infractions.
Thank you, and I've got myself and Director Nicholson. Anyone else? Acton again. So just to follow up, I think in more of a general nature, and I'm glad I've got you up there, Mr. McDonald. You know, I understand being here a while that we sort of go in cycles sometimes. We do a lot more enforcing, and then we often will do everything that we can to achieve compliance through means other than going to court. And I know it goes back and forth a little bit, but I think Director Acton's comment about the Wild West, I think that comes and goes depending on, the nature of complaints, we have everything from burning to nuisance properties and the likes, but we do have our municipal ticketing tool in the toolbox, and I guess what I'm asking is, I don't know if I saw in the report, I think I saw a number of tickets that were issued, I think it was 18 last year, but are we making most effective use of that sort of tool? Are staff comfortable that they're at that fine balance of going to enforcement where appropriate and using other methods to achieve compliance? How comfortable are you in where we sit today?
I will comment on it, and then also comment on it, because we've actually discussed this before, but typically the tickets are a last resort. We look for voluntary compliance as a first resort. And going forward, I think the tool's been very good because it is a good tool to threaten with, but however, if we can just get voluntary compliance, it's a much easier path. There can be a lot of costs involved should somebody not pay. I'm going to turn this over to Nino to further comment on that.
Exactly what I was going to say. As you mentioned, it's a tool in our limited toolbox, and we will get to that. But as any bylaw officer has been trained to enforce bylaws, it is a last resort. It's not a first resort.
Fair enough, thank you. I've got Director Nicholson, Wilson, then Acton. Director Nicholson.
Thank you. So I noticed that waste management is, incurs the highest calls to service, and that particularly backyard burning is the most common complaint in this category. So I think that, well, I guess my question is, I know we're not harmonized on the smoke bylaw with the other jurisdictions, which I think would be really useful because people generally don't know where they live, what jurisdiction they're in. So it seems to me that that would be really important. And I'm wondering also if there are other bylaws that we should be looking at trying to harmonize with other jurisdictions that would make things easier. I'm not sure what the variation and things like dog control and parks and so forth is, but I think the more standard that we can be, the more success we'll have. Number one would be a comment. I don't know if you have anything to say on that front.
I can,
Mr. McDonald.
We are currently working with North Cowichan on a smoking bylaw, and also I'm reviewing the animal control bylaw to look to harmonize with their animal control bylaw. So those are two that are currently in the works.
That's great. And can I have a follow-up question? So then I am interested in, I noticed that there's nothing in your report under communications, and I think that there's a real opportunity here to do an ongoing communications with the community on our bylaws and why we think they're important, what the benefit is to follow those bylaws for the community, and what they can do to help us, right? Like I don't want to advocate to everyone to go snitching on their neighbors, but I think that people need to understand what their recourse is a little bit better. But first of all, they need to understand why they should even care about the burning bylaw or the dog control bylaw or the tiny home bylaw or whatever. And I think we have that, for starters, we have that ad thing in the paper. We could just have little blurbs on different things all the time. But we need to kind of have I think we need to develop a bit of a communication strategy around bylaw enforcement. If we don't have one already, but maybe we do.
Mr. McDonald, have you had any conversations with Mr. Schumacher on initiatives?
Not currently, but that may be something that would be investigated shortly.
Thank you. I've got Director Wilson, then Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I've said it before to Nino and his colleagues that I don't envy them the job that they have to do, given that we're giving them bylaws to enforce, which in most cases are unenforceable. Regardless, we make a bylaw which says we will do this, that, and the other, and then we give permission for a industrial site to be put there. We make a zone for an industrial site to put there, or a facility to be put there. And then we say, that's it, we've got no jurisdiction whatsoever now. We hand this over to the province. So whatever we've done, whatever bylaw we've got here, really has no effect. All we've done is said, go build it, and somebody else will take care of the problems, and that's just wrong, and I do not envy you your job at all. Not a question.
Director Acton.
Just to clarify, my Wild West was about bylaws that we do actually have control of zoning and that kind of thing. But my questions is back to what Mr. McDonald said about previous managers trying to do a review. So if people have tried to do it already, you know, I think bylaw is pretty important, and I hope that it's going to be part of our strategic plan on Friday. So a third-party review, to me, if there's funding for it, would be ideal so that we could help, I'm not trying to criticize, but things can always improve. So how we could do that moving forward, because if managers in the past tried to do it, it's obviously, you have a lot of work to do already. And like most things that we have here, it's hard to have a objective view when you're in it. So is there anything that we can do today to help in that regard? Do we need to?
Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was sitting here listening to the conversation, I was thinking exactly what Director Acton just said, is that you have an opportunity on Friday to have a discussion. And, when I look at some of the critical issues that the Electoral Area Services Committee is dealing with, bylaw enforcement is one of them. And I would be very surprised if you don't have a fairly in-depth conversation about some of those issues, like education, public education. What other enforcement tools do we have? Do we want to do a review of how we're currently delivering that service? I think that's a really important discussion to have on Friday.
And just a quick follow-up to that, and I think that it's incumbent on us to come with the thoughts and areas of that we'd like to target, because for the most part, I think staff do a pretty good job in an ever-changing environment, because one year it could be inappropriate riparian incursions at Cowichan Lake are a big deal, or at Shawnigan Lake, and then it could be backyard burning the next season, or proliferation of illegal wharf structures. So I think that if you've got key areas of concern that you'd like to discuss further, then we have that opportunity on Friday. So. Any other, so we've looked at bylaw enforcement, we've got year-end development services report. Are there any of these other information item reports that directors would like to delve into specifically? Director Acton, next.
Are you including R14 in this?
Nope. Just items R10 through R13. So is everybody satisfied with that? Then I guess we go through to the next item, which is R14, and we have a report in our package. And will anybody be speaking to it specifically? Director Acton.
You're too quick for me, though. Okay. Maybe I guess I might need some help here, but I'd like to recommend that we allot for the APC's volunteer appreciation, $1,500 each, and $2,200 for Area B, because we are too big.
Well, looking at the staff report, there's an option 1 that has part 1, which is essentially that where you replace the $800 figure with another figure. Looking at staff, is it problematic to single out a specific amount for a specific area, or would it be just wise to have one amount for all of the areas? Mr. Kieber, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. How to say this? typically, it would be one amount for each electoral area. It's cost shared by the entire regional district electoral areas, so it's not usual to cost share by the entire electoral areas and give one more than the others.
That's kind of what I suspected, so I'm wondering if it might be appropriate to just pick a number that's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,200 and call it a day. I know I won't spend anywhere near that amount, but I certainly understand Director Acton's numerous members of various committees. I've got Director Yanni DiNardo, then Nicholson. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize that they do have 8,000 with their population, but their APCs in their parks would be the same amount as the rest of us, would they not be? How are they bigger? I thought we had-
Hang on.
Sorry.
So each area has different size and different populations, so it can vary from area to area. So, her request isn't unreasonable, but I think that for simplicity's sake, that, like, I'm not gonna spend much more than $1,200 probably on my volunteer appreciation dinner. Follow-up, Director Yanni DiNardo?
Well, I was gonna suggest what would be reasonable. I know 800 is a little hard for us, but the number that came up to me was the 1,200. So I'm not sure if that's something that's a little bit more palatable, but I would like to suggest that the 1,200.
Well, can I ask you to hang on to that motion for just a second until I've heard from Director Nicholson?
Well, it took me about 3 or 4 years to clue into the fact that this even existed and was possible. And so I have never used this, and then I have not been able to figure out how I can do it appropriately for $800 since then. So it seems to me, and I would definitely like to do something to show my appreciation to all the members of people who have served on the Parks and APC Commission since I started. So I'm wondering if it's possible, like if you don't do something one year, if you can roll your amount to the next year so you could do a group thing, a larger thing, you'd have more money to work with. Because, even $1,200 I think will be very difficult at this point for me. And I don't like to exclude people who have served in the community. Yeah.
So I think in reading the report, I think staff are absolutely recommending against having that carryover option. So understanding that, so I think that it would be wise of us to choose a number that makes sense, that directors could allocate to appropriately recognizing their volunteers within, the calendar year and the budget year. So I think that's what staff is recommending. So I would ask that we look at figuring out what a dollar amount is and trying to live within it. And just a personal comment, as I said, I probably wouldn't spend in excess of $1,200, but I think we should try and be flexible. And besides, it's not us that we're talking about our volunteers. So I think it might be wise to be as generous as reasonable in this circumstance. Director Acton, I'll go to you, and then we had 2 people interested in a motion. Director Acton.
Just like to explain our situation, Area B, and point out that this is going to be a pot of money that we're all going to be putting in by our electoral area, and so Area B is going to cover 1/3 of that pot. And so we had appreciations we had 2 separate ones because we had so many people. One appreciation, I panhandled from the community, all of it, except for I paid out of my own pocket $400 to cover that. And then on the Christmas appreciation for the other groups, at a $25 each a dinner, not extravagant, I went over the budget by $150. So it's pretty tight, and that's by getting a bunch of donations as well to cover it.
Director Smith.
So I'd just like some clarification, because it says APC and Parks Commission's policy, and that's the people that are to be in, that is the appreciation is for, is the APCs and the Parks Commissions. It's not beyond that, or is it beyond that?
Mr. Kieber.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it is specifically for the APCs and the Parks Commissions. So that's who it's applicable to.
So I turned to Director Yanni Donardo, who had a motion in mind, and asked her to consider what she's heard and make a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I have a question to staff. Listening to Director Acton, is it appropriate that directors look for donations in kind? I don't know. I don't know if we're, like, it's kind of a sticky point for me. I just wonder if that.
I think it's a more than fair question, but I don't know that it is necessarily a question for this
Okay, thank you.
particular discussion, but
I'd like to move $1,200 budget, and so increasing the transfer from operating reserve by whatever. Sorry? Yeah, so increasing the budget to that amount as well.
1,200 and 3,600 in the blanks that are on page 2 of this report.
Yeah.
Is there a seconder? Seconded by Director Smith. Any further discussion? Director Nicholson.
I guess I'm still not clear why rolling money over from one year to the next, having it part of the policy that you can do that over 2 years would be a problem, number one. And number two, it seems to me that given that we've got APCs that have different numbers, it makes more sense to tie the amount that you have with the size of your number of volunteers. I mean, it doesn't seem right that if you have a small APC of 5 people that you would get $1,200 and someone else has an APC of 14, they get $1,200. It doesn't seem very fair to me.
Turn to finance.
Through the chair to Director Nicholson, right now the finances for these APC appreciation contributions are done through one account. So to keep track of it separately, they would have to have separate accounts set up for each one, and then when there's a joint initiative that takes place, we'd have to try and split up the funds between those 3 or 4 different areas and keep track of those funds moving from year to year as a rolling. So it would be a lot of administration.
Okay, I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion carries. Next item will be, and that'll go to the next board meeting.
Mr. Chair, will that go to the board,
Yes?
that decision? Thank you.
Next item will be R15, and that's, I believe we're getting Ms. Soldera to steer us through this discussion. And you have a presentation for us as well. Excellent.
So the presentation is just to lead through the discussion. Okay, so as the committee is aware, gas tax funds in this third round of funding total about just over $10 million for the 5 years of the program. The committee and then the board approved allocating this funding 60% to electoral areas by population, 30% to asset management infrastructure investments, and 10% to asset management capacity building. And we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking today about the 30%, which is just over $3 million. And so, as we can see, of the $3 million for 2019 to 2024, our 2020 allocations already approved, total $1.5 million exactly, leaving just over $1.5 million for the remainder of the term of this gas tax agreement. So it's that remainder, that just over 1.5 that we're talking about today. And so there was a resolution brought forward in October that staff prepare a report on a broad-based strategy plan for funding the allocation of Community Works Fund CWF 3.0 Asset Management Infrastructure Investment total of $3,019,423 for years 2 to 5 prior to a new asset management infrastructure project funding summary. Took a lot of words. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And so throughout the discussions, I have heard that the committee was perhaps interested in leaving some funds unallocated. And so the first question for discussion today would be, does the committee wish to leave some funds allocated, bearing in mind that there is only $1.5 million for the next 4 years?
I'm assuming you'd like some discussion on
I
each of these
definitely
items
would,
as you bring them up, so.
I have designed the PowerPoint in a way that I hope will get us to some discussion that staff can then bring back a summary report for you.
Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I have no problem with having an emergency fund whatsoever. I've always been a great believer in it, that kind of thing. If you can put it away and save it for a rainy day, then by all means do so.
Thank you, Director Smith.
So I would not be in favor of an emergency contingency allocation. I feel that a lot of the systems should have some emergency planning in place for something that comes up. Yes, it would be nice to have, but with only $1.5 million left in the pot, it's an emergency is something that each system should have to look after on their own.
Thank you, and I've got a question and then perhaps a comment, depending on the answer for you, Ms. Soldera. So, given emergencies happen every day, if this fund, if we were to choose not to proceed with an emergency pot, how will most emergencies that that could be incurred be dealt with today?
Most emergencies are just done through the regular course of business. We would usually bring forward a budget amendment suggesting the use of reserve funds when we have them available, or borrowing if we needed to, in order to accomplish dealing with whatever emergency we had. In this case, any projects that are approved from years 2 to 5 can always be amended at any time. So even if the funds were fully allocated, and we've actually had that happen already a couple of times with respect to this fund, where projects have been changed or projects have been moved forward in the list in order to accommodate the needs of the particular projects.
So thank you for that. And just a general comment, in the previous round of Community Works funds, the board made the decision to not allocate all of the funds until later in the agreement. And I think that made a lot of sense, given that we weren't as far on not only our condition assessments, but our asset management program in general. And the concept of reserve funds was still off in the distant future. And so I'm just looking at the fact that we've begun and implemented a lot of work on this front. Having an emergency in a sewer system or water system isn't nearly as dire a circumstance today as it might have been 5 years ago. So while I generally agree with the idea that it's nice to have an unallocated sum of money to address these things, it's a fairly small amount, and I think I'm comfortable in moving forward without, but it's up to the committee to decide what to recommend to the board on this. So, Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I'm not sure that emergency is the right word. I think when I was thinking about allocating all the money to the project list that was proposed based on some risk criteria that staff used, I was thinking that there may be other issues that arise over the next few years that may encourage you to want to rethink that list. And I know, although we can reallocate things, I know that once things get on the list approved, it's very difficult to claw back. So I was thinking that it would be smart just to, at least for the first couple of years, have a little bit set aside in case there are unforeseen things that come up. And I wasn't necessarily thinking emergency as in the pipe just broke, because I tend to think that, like Director Smith, I mean, we should be planning for that as we manage our systems. Yeah, so I think maybe we could come back to this discussion after we talk about the criteria. It might be more helpful to me.
Seeing no other suggestions, let's move on to the next bit.
All right.
We'll come back.
So throughout the discussion, there was a lot of talk about the words equity and fairness, so I just thought I'd put them out there. I know I looked up the definitions just to make sure I was aware of what they were. So equity, the quality of being fair or impartial, giving as much advantage to one party as another, and fairness was freedom from bias or injustice and a lack of favoritism. So definitely devising a set of standardized criteria will meet these definitions of equity and fairness, but just stressing them here for get them front of everyone's mind. So today I've proposed a number of criteria for consideration, and it's definitely not staff's decision. This is a decision for you, so that's why I'm presenting them and hoping that you'll help make a bunch of decisions today. Factors that I've included for discussion here are urgency, type of service, level of service, strategic plan, health and safety, grant funding, cost savings, and ability to pay. And we'll go through each of those. This is by no means an exhaustive list, so I would definitely appreciate your feedback and your thoughts if there are other criteria that you think should be included or should weigh more heavily in the evaluation of projects.
Can you hang on just there?
Absolutely.
Director Smith and then Acton. Director Smith.
So looking through the criteria, I feel that there's definitely a couple of areas that are missing in this criteria. So if we want to have that added, do we add it now or do we add it after we go through the criteria that's on here?
Well, I think it'd be more than appropriate if you've got a couple of suggestions that you put them on the floor for us to all consider, and maybe they can be added to the list.
So one of the criteria that I think is really important is a breakdown basically of the utility parcel taxes as to how much of the portion is for operations and maintenance and how much is set aside for the capital asset infrastructure.
Can I interrupt for just a second? So we're going to go through each of these and have that description. So were you able to, like, in a 2 or 3 word phrase so that we could add it to the criteria? I've got you down, Director Kuhn, because we're going to have a description of each of those and we haven't begun yet. So is that reasonable from where you sit?
So maybe Ms. Solder could use 2 or 3 words that would fit that as criteria. And also, I think it's important that we look at how much money each utility system has funded over the past 10 years on their infrastructure, their capital infrastructure, without any grant funding. So I'm not sure what 2 or 3 words would cover that one also.
I believe.
Self-sufficiency?
Some of it is included in the previous grants and could be part of the discussion of ability to pay. So those are some of the things that I've included in that kind of discussion. So we might touch on actually both of those items as we get to the ability to pay section.
And just,
I've definitely made note of them, so.
and just on the first one, and I know I've had this discussion with Mr. Dennison on a number of occasions, that there once was a breakdown between, sort of parcel tax and capital, and operating was just run off of the annual billing. But it's been years since that has been an effective way of analyzing it. So I don't know that there's even an ability today to be able to separate out those two functions. So, Director Smith?
Well, I know that the Saltaire Water System in 2012 increased their parcel tax by 171% for capital projects only, for infrastructure. So there is there needs to be documentation someplace within each system as to, is it only is the parcel tax only covering the operation and maintenance? Is that what it's collected for?
Well,
or
let's,
is it
let's
collect-
ask the
part of
guy
it
that knows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, in reality, they're just two sources of income. And they come in this particular case, we did that by increasing the parcel tax. It was just judgment, though. We could have just as well increased the user fee. In Eagle Heights, there's only user fee. There is no parcel tax. Same with Arbutus Ridge as well. So we don't even have a parcel tax there. We don't, and we did very large works in Arbutus Ridge recently, a big, huge upgrade, lots and lots of money, and it's just user fees were increased, no parcel tax at all, because we don't charge parcel tax. So there's no requirement of the Local Government Act or no actual constraint at all. We just view it as two income streams.
Follow up?
Follow up. So to me, what I'm looking for is I would like to see how much user fee taxpayer parcel tax have been put towards the infrastructures in the last, say, 7 years, that those are what the taxpayers and the users are putting into their systems to actually upgrade their systems, not just operate their systems or maintain their systems. I mean, I know how much, and I can only speak for Saltaire because I'm very familiar with it, but I do know that it's $1.5 million that only came from the taxpayers of Saltaire, and it wasn't any grant money that went into it. So we should be able to look at that to see, you know, the portions that are, it's a financial responsibility for systems upgrades that we need to have a look at. So that's
Mr. Dennison?
Certainly capital investment could be tabulated for each of the systems. If I may, Mr. Chairman, one other comment though on the charges for each of the utilities. A really large factor is the size of the utility. So small utilities, you know, the BC Water and Waste Association, when you go listen to the talks and they talk about small utilities, 10,000 customers is a small utility. So ours are like subatomic. They're really, really small, but the same standards still apply just as though, so Cherry Point Water at 30 customers, the same standards apply as though it was the city of Burnaby, right? And so it's, for small systems, it's very, very challenging to meet all the requirements and rules and everything else. So you end up having very high rates, and it gets to be people higher rates because they look at other people. Most people just don't understand that, right? So they look around them, they don't see as higher rates, and they say, well, this is already so much money, you can't charge us more, even though it may be necessary. And so it's very hard for us to accumulate those kind of monies for capital investment with a small system. It's much easier in a larger system. Although even with large systems, our large systems are still very small, right, in terms of utilities, so it's still a challenge.
So in order to meet Director Smith's concerns, I think we should make sure that we cover this under the ability to pay and
thank you.
So Director Acton, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'm seeing this from a different perspective, I think. So finance and engineering is stacked with a whole bunch of professionals. And we've been doing this for a while with the recommendations and how we've been allocating gas tax funds. And it's very clear that Director Smith is not, is kind of driving the bus on all of this information that's being provided. This feels like a little bit overload, like we're creating a work project here for staff. We keep sending them back to create more information. I need this, I need more information. And we're here to serve our communities. And we're also here just to do what's best and it's not all gonna be 100% perfect, but we have to weigh it. And this doesn't even seem like very much money that we're talking about. And when you look at the big grand scheme of things. So I'd like to this feels like we're trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're trying to please someone's perspective because there's a perception of something.
Mr. Carruthers.
Sure. So I agree. This is in the order of magnitude. This is not a lot of money. It's, given our expenditures on an annual basis, $1.5 million doesn't go very far in terms of significant infrastructure projects. I think the challenge that I see is that to backcast and look at the decisions that were made in the past about funding is incredibly difficult, because so many factors go into previous decisions by boards around why they funded certain projects, how much they funded them, the tolerance of their taxpayers, the competing interests around the board table. I mean, it's just really, really hard to establish a criteria that would kind of rationalize previous decisions. That would be my observation as your administrator. I think moving forward, there's a lot of questions that Ms. Soldera is asking you, because there are a lot of questions that have to be answered for staff to put something together. And so I'm looking at the amount of effort being put into this for the sake of the fact that we have an asset management program. The board originally gave staff instructions to go away and base that 30% on our asset management program based on risk and condition assessment. And we've done that with the first round. There appears to be a desire on the part of the board to apply a different criteria to the remaining funds. And I think you just have to grapple with how much effort you want staff to put into coming up with these answers to these questions versus your original direction that you gave to staff.
So I've got Director Kuhn, myself, Nicholson, and Smith. Director Kuhn. Okay, thank you. And what Mr. Carruthers is saying is rings true with me, and I just, well, maybe I'm partly to blame, but I don't think it was the last round, but the round before, when the gas tax was allocated and brought to the board, we got about that close to allocating 100% of it based on population. And it was literally at a board meeting where we thought, hang on, maybe we should put, was it 10 or 20% away for future years. And we ended up in a very enviable position in that we had some crises and we had some dollars that managed to match. And it was a fairly simple program. This is diving very deep into criteria where I could see us perhaps saying, no, let's not allocate and make decisions in future years. But it's very clear that fairness needs to be a component of that. And some areas have been beneficiaries of those extra amounts and other areas haven't. So I state that as an observation, and that these are grant funds that we need all of the directors, or most of the directors, to feel that there's a fairness in how it's allocated. I turn to Director Nicholson next.
Thank you. So I get that it is useful to make sure that we feel that there's some level of equity among these various kinds of fruit in the fruit bowl, right? It's hard to do it, but there should be some level of comfort on the fairness front. I think that I was concerned when we had that original list of projects. If I remember correctly, they were based on this risk assessment, and there were ones that were getting, it wasn't clear where we should draw the line on the risk, and there's an additional issue of new standards coming along, and that plays into ability to pay on new standards the front. And I think probably most importantly, I was interested in the strategic issue of starting to try to amalgamate systems so that we have some economy of scale. And I wasn't clear how that was playing into the criteria for putting things on the list. I think the list, if I recall correctly, it was strictly based on sort of risk based on condition and liability to the CVRD. And I thought that there should be a little bit more nuance in that, even though it is a small amount of money. I mean, I think the direction is, from my perspective, is we need to over time, try to amalgamate systems so that we don't have such a problem. Yeah, so I thought we could have but this maybe is getting down, I think we should continue going through these things and then come back to it, just to refresh our memories. It's hard because I don't have that original report in front of me to jog my memory on how I was thinking.
Thank you. I think what's really important as directors is we are being looked at that we're rewarding systems for not taking financial responsibility for their aging infrastructure. If you do not take financial responsibility for your aging infrastructure, it creates higher risk, which puts you at a higher level on that risk assessment that's been done. We all might remember the ANOVA report from 2017 that indicated that there was a need by all the systems to actually step forward, whether it's a local decision or how they go about doing it, but we needed to take financial responsibility. Some areas had already taken financial responsibility, but to see a system that it has a project for $800,000 be funded for 88% of that project, when exactly did that system step up and take financial responsibility for their aging system? If you go back and you look at, there's one system that the taxpayers are being actually rewarded as a financial benefit to that per parcel of approximately $33,000 from the Community Works funds and grants. Does that sound, I mean, everybody in my community would also like to be benefited by $33,000 per parcel, but it just hasn't happened. So I think it's really important that we take a big look at who's being rewarded for not putting financial responsibility into their own system. And those that have put money into their system should also be rewarded in a fashion that is acceptable. And I think those are really important things, that if systems haven't taken on a financial responsibility since the 2017 ANOVA report, then they should not be rewarded. And those that have should also move to be, I think it's the percentage of the allocations should be looked at, whether the high risk is there because they haven't financially been responsible. And I don't know since 2017 how many systems have actually increased their taxation to take on those aging infrastructure. And that's something I'd like to see. But, you know, that's something, I've got a community that stepped up to the plate, did a local decision, and has put $1.5 million into a system, which is approximately $2,500 each parcel. And when you look back at all the allocations throughout this whole system of Community Works Fund, it's not been treated as if they put effort into it. So you can't go to a community and say, let's increase your taxation because it doesn't work, because I see other areas haven't done it and they're getting rewarded higher funding, and maybe I should tell my community to stop funding so that we can go back into a higher risk and then maybe be available for the same as some of the others here. So I'm really hoping that we can move through this and look at how we can reward the people who actually step forward and take steps back for the ones that might need to have something, and that we are fair and that we are equitable.
Thank you. Ms. Soldera, please continue.
So the first criterion that is up for discussion today is urgency, and should urgency be included as a criterion? Meaning, is there an immediate need, or can the project be done over time? And if so, what would we constitute as an immediate need, and how would we define critical infrastructure?
Director Smith.
So I think that the list was based on risk, which would be, in my mind, urgencies. I believe that staff put together the list based on that criteria already, and I think that risk is an important factor. As to the percentage of funding for that risk, it has to meet some other criteria. But I think urgency, that's what the list already is.
Any other comments? Director Acton?
Well, I don't know how the rest of the committee feels, but based on what Mr. Carruthers said, and maybe we could give staff a break here and actually let them bring stuff forward as it comes, because we have professional engineers and professional accountants. So I'd be willing to make a motion, if I had other people's support, to chalk this up as just creating too much work for staff, and recognizing that we would carry on as business as usual.
Given consideration what you've just said, I think that that may be something that we get to, but I think there's been a body of work that's been completed and ready for presentation that is reasonable to at least consider for ultimately maybe considering that question towards the end of this. I think that this is good education for us to consider, and we do have to make a decision on $1.5 million over the next 2 to 5 years, unless it's the will of the committee to consider that question right now. Do we want to consider a motion to not continue, or do we want to continue to see the presentation? Somebody look at me. Director Smith.
I'd like to continue with the presentation. I feel that the staff has put a lot of work into this. It was something that, as a table, we asked for. We all agreed on it, and that it was something that staff has put the time into, and I think it's a really important discussion to make sure that everything looks to be fair and equitable, and I appreciate the time that's gone into this, so I'm looking forward to the continuation.
Director Nicholson, anything to add?
No, I'm good with that, but I just want for clarification, this is money for asset management that is high priority, and I would assume that we're only talking about water and sewer systems, because this problem should go away if we do asset management right, should it not, over time? But right now, we've got a real critical thing with water and sewer, because we don't have economy of scale, and we've got small systems that are in apparently crisis mode. So can I understand that this should go away over time, and we're just dealing with the immediate problems that we have?
Ms. Soldera?
You're absolutely correct. As the asset management plan goes forward, and as we start being better able to save and put away for a rainy day, then yes, it should eventually go away. As to whether this is just sewer and water infrastructure, that's actually one of the questions later on.
I see that, and that sort of surprised me.
We had a parks project that was on the list so staff worked as a group, as noted in my report, to narrow down the list that was presented to the committee and then the board. That list did include parks projects previously, and they were removed given the lack of available funding. So with limited resources, staff chose to focus more on the sewer and water, but it is absolutely up to the board's discretion.
And I think your analysis of should this go away, and that's what I was referencing earlier is the last round or the round before that, we had no path to making it go away. And now that we've got the reserve fund policies and the likes, we should be discussion unnecessary in future rounds. So, Director Kuhn? And the question is, do we want to continue with the presentation?
Well, I appreciate what some of the people, some of the board members said. I'm all for justice too. I do not like injustice. It's kind of in my system. But it's very difficult to try to get total justice in a project like this. There's always going to be some injustice involved. I'm just wondering, I would be ready to just trust staff with their recommendations. And I wonder if staff do consider parcel taxes that are being paid, if that is in any way being considered. Because I appreciate what Director Smith said. If there is a system that's in dire straits because the users have not paid up, or and suddenly it's on an urgency schedule, and now we all pay for it. It's not quite right, and I appreciate that. But I wonder, I don't want to get too deep into it, because we can get lost in this thing. I mean, we can dive forever and ever and ever, and we'll still not have total justice. So I wonder if staff can come up with a recommendation, maybe a little bit of a combination as to, okay, considering that this unit has so much on paid on parcel taxes or whatever, and get it done this way.
So with respect to Director Gruen, that's exactly why we're here, is they brought forward a set of criteria that we supported for year one, and that we asked them to come back with years 2 to 5 with a more in-depth criteria. And so the question is, do we want to listen to the rest of the presentation so we've got a clearer understanding of what's going to be considered for this, or we can go to what Director Acton had said is stop and let staff decide. But I'm going to go to
I'd be in
Mr.
favor of
Carruthers.
stopping it, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So maybe some consideration. I'll go back to the original proposal. You had, as Ms. Soldera explained, about $10 million allocated over the next 5 years. The hybrid approach that staff brought forward to you was 60% of those funds to be allocated on an equity basis on population to the electoral areas with essentially no criteria. Those funds are there, and directors are making their decisions and recommendations based on no criteria, and 30% funds allocated on a regional basis for staff to make recommendations based on our asset management plan. So there was a compromise. That was the compromise that came forward originally. So I would almost argue that you should be investing your time on the 60%, which is about $6 million, versus the half of the 30%, which is 1.5 million remaining. You have numerous bylaw amendments coming forward to you for water systems where we're increasing the rates regularly to keep pace. The whole intention of your asset management program is to start fresh. We can't look back at decisions that were made. The reasons for decisions were made by a whole group of people around this table in the past with a whole bunch of different factors that were considered. The intent of your asset management program is that you make better decisions moving forward, and that they're based on good, sound science and asset condition assessments and risk. The next phase of the asset management plan are going to be your sustainable service delivery plans that are going to come forward, that are going to address the unique needs of each of our asset classes, so that you can make decisions around parcel taxes, user fees, requisitions, so that you have money in the bank to be able to fund those assets in the future. So, just again, for context, Staff made the recommendation, you have $6 million of your community works funds that are discretionary and allocated out on an equitable basis based on population. So we're only talking about half of 30% that's remaining for this exercise.
So, thank you, and we've all had the report for a few days, we've read it, we've got staff before us, let's listen to what they have to, and we can choose to do nothing at the end, but I think it's good information for us to digest. Please continue.
So as Director Smith noted, urgency was actually one of the criteria, and it does factor into our capital asset management plan. But it will ultimately be this committee's decision with a recommendation to the board as to whether urgency continues to be one of the top criterion that we use when evaluating projects.
I'm going to suggest that you just rattle on through your presentation, and then if committee members decide that they want to go back and discuss any particular item, that we can do that. So please continue.
Okay. So the next criterion is health and safety. So included in this criterion could be, are there regular boil water advisories? Is raw sewage seeping onto land? Would a new roof for a park shelter constitute an urgent need or a health and safety risk if it's unsafe for public use without it? And this goes directly to the previous question. As one of the original projects suggested in our asset management plan was roofs for the picnic shelters at Bright Angel Park. And so staff chose not to pursue that one through the 30%, given the other sewer and water infrastructure needs at the time. But that's definitely within this committee's purview to make a choice about that. Next is the type of service. So should a utility project be ranked higher than a parks or recreation project? Also, should assets that haven't been assessed yet through the asset management planning process be excluded from funding? So our asset management plan is not yet complete, and not all of our asset classes have been assessed. So vehicles, for instance, haven't been included yet. They will be very shortly. I know Austin's working very hard, but should that be a criterion that is considered, whether there is a condition assessment for that asset? And so this will go faster without decisions, but so previous grants. So should previous grant funding be included as a criterion? And if so, what type of grants are we talking about? Are we talking about gas tax funding awarded from a director, or are we talking about federal infrastructure grants, provincial grants? How long ago would that grant be considered? What if a sewer grant was given for a particular area? Would that impact any potential water projects that they have? So if one particular group of taxpayers are the same group that gets both a sewer and a water system, should the water systems project be considered in terms of a sewer grant that they received? So also levels of service. Should impact to levels of service be included as a criterion? Will the project result in increased service levels? Or if we don't do the project and service levels will be reduced, is that a consideration? Also, what might be the financial or staff implications of making these decisions? And cost savings. So some projects will result in lower ongoing operating costs. Should that make a project score higher? And if so, what indicators would we use to evaluate those potential savings? Items that are in our strategic plan. So if an item is directly in the board's strategic plan, and I know you're meeting on Friday, but should items that are directly address strategic planning objectives score higher than projects that do not? And if there isn't a project in the strategic plan, but there's a master plan or a study that supports the project, should that be considered as well? And ability to pay is the last big decision. And so the ability of the service area to pay for the project, does that have an impact on the decision? And how is that determined? Cost per user, total annual parcel taxes and user fees, total property taxes per area. So in my report, and not particularly on the slide, I listed a number of items that could affect some of the costs to operate various systems, such as geography. Is the land flat or sloped? So nothing the fault of the taxpayers at all, but just, you know, the geography that's out there. The number of users, as more users join a system, sometimes rates go down because your economies of scale, you're out among more people, but your fixed costs always remain the same. Also standards. So if somebody's using groundwater and another system's using surface water and they have different standards that they have to meet. Class A sewage treatment versus no standard. Should we consider those sorts of things? In the case of a water system, how about the quality of the groundwater? Not all of our systems actually have manganese. I know that manganese is a big issue this year that came up in a lot of supplemental requests, but not every single system has manganese. So should the ones that do have manganese not benefit because of some other factor? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Also, lack of a sustainable service delivery plan. So we are required by law to link the cost of providing our service with the fees that we charge for that service. And so if we don't have a long-term asset replacement plan or a long-term service delivery plan, sometimes it's not possible for us to make that link. And so we can't, while we can increase parcel taxes, we cannot increase our user rates above a level that we can justify. Also political decisions. So area directors, as Mr. Carruthers mentioned a few times, area directors current or past may not be supportive of rate increases. Rates can't be increased without board approval. And so the taxpayers of today they didn't have a say in the decisions of the past board or the past directors, and so how does that weigh into the decision? So included with my report were a couple of spreadsheets that I think are on this, or here, that I can bring up for you. And so they include utility rates over time. So I've included a breakdown, and it's kind of small. See if I can make it any bigger. Of taxes and user fees over the last 5 years. And so I've looked at the change over 5 years. In some cases, parcels, or so, I was going to say it's more noticeable in the sewer section. Oh, here we go. In that we have actually amalgamated a few of our systems. So we're working on that as we go. So our Twin Cedars sewer system and our Cobble Hill Village sewer system are now part of the Function 812 Cobble Hill Village. And so that's why you'll see the different numbers there. But so included with it was this ability to pay. Also included with the report was a schedule included in the ANOVA report that talked about the number of users of a particular system and the replacement cost per user. And so you can see that in some cases, the cost for water systems varies from a low of $10,672 per user to a high of $179,944 per user, just based on the size of that system. So, and even if you look at systems with similar numbers of users, that high cost of $179,000 is for a system with only 26 users, but we have another system with 27 users that has a per user cost of only $45,000. And so how do you factor that into the decisions that you're making? Obviously, your parcel taxes will vary quite considerably between those two systems, even though they are somewhat similar, but it's based on the circumstances of the day. So that is the criterion that I put forward, and I'm happy to add or to answer any questions or return to any sections.
Director Wilson. I have to say that every time either Ms. Saldera or Natalie Wayno steps up to the podium, I'm always incredibly impressed with the work that they put into this thing and the way they explain things. It makes it that much simpler for me, so thank you very much for what you've done there. I've got a lot of sympathy with what Director Smith, her problem that she has there, where her constituents have been paying in and yet are not seeing some of the benefits of some of this money which is available. And I'm sure there must be some way that we can find with the creative skills that you've got to reward is probably not the right word, but to compensate their taxpayers for some of the money that they've already put in there. I don't know what the answer to that one is. I do have a lot of sympathy for what's being said here, because the opposite happened in my area in Cobble Hill, where people hadn't put a lot in there and yet received a lot of benefit out of it. I honestly don't know what the answer is to the predicament that they find themselves in, but I know that if you guys look into it, you'll find a way.
Got myself on the list here next, and you know, I think you had the slide fairness and equity up there, and I think that plays a fairly major role in this. And one of the things that struck me and having discussions with staff, and I understand that Saltaire hasn't been the recipient of grant funds outside of this envelope, and I don't know how that factor can be you know, brought into this discussion, because there are just so many variables that go into why a system receives a grant, and they're well beyond what this organization has any impact on. There are provincial and federal grant programs that are analyzed and critiqued on the basis of the information in the application, and we may think that an application for a Saltaire project is absolutely the best project and the best one for this regional district, and it can be denied by the grant funders. And so does that denial play into the decisions that we have to make on this 1.5 million of community works funds? So that's a real tough one to try and work into this formula when you know, I can talk of one system that really wasn't expecting to get some dollars, and it fell into our laps. So I'm sure that that if we were to trust staff with a set of criteria and a priority list, I'd be comfortable with that. But it's not just me; it's this committee and how we decide that we want to move forward. And we're going to have to decide today whether or not we want to, you know, chew on this one a little bit more today, or whether it's to give it back to staff and trust what they recommend to us. So I turn it to committee members to give direction on what you want to do next. Director Kuhn.
I'd like to send it back to staff and let them decide.
Were you seconding that, or were you just putting your hand up to speak next? So, Director Acton, were you seconding that? Sure. So we have a resolution to refer this back to staff for, I'm gathering a priority list. Director Smith, you're next on the list.
So I agree it should go back to staff. One of the things, I would like to make two recommendations that when it goes back to staff, that two other areas are considered in the criteria. And so I have two recommendations. Can I make those?
Well, hang on, we have a resolution on the floor. So I would look to Ms. Harrison and ask, would it be appropriate to consider the recommendation that's on the floor and then additional recommendations afterwards? That's what you're recommending. So we have a recommendation to refer this back to staff to develop a criteria and priority list. That's the resolution. That's
Ask a
you point
question
of order?
around that?
Yes, sure.
So if we're going to pass that motion, we're saying, okay, we want your opinion, but whoa, wait, we want your opinion to include this? So
And we
is that-
can approve or deny those
Okay.
subsequent resolutions. And our parliamentarian suggests that's the way forward. So seeing no other hands, I'm going to call the hands waving over there. Yes,
So
Mr. Carruthers.
for the benefit of our staff, I'm not clear on the resolution, because I'm hearing refer back to staff to give a priority list, but also refer back to staff to develop criteria. And I'm not clear on what it is that the committee is expecting us. Do you simply want us to come back?
No,
Okay.
fair
So
enough.
we can get clarity for
Fair
our
enough.
staff.
So
Yep.
my understanding of the resolution is that this be referred back to staff to develop a priority list of recommended projects. Okay? That's the resolution before us. Now, we may have subsequent resolutions to consider other criteria in that, and whether they pass or fail is up to the committee. So is everyone clear on what the resolution is now?
Can I ask?
Director Nicholson.
So we already have a priority list that was provided to us. So my question is, what are we looking at that's going to be different than that?
Should be pretty easy for the staff to produce that list then, won't it?
Well, that doesn't seem like a very helpful thing.
We have a motion that's been moved and seconded. I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? We have 2 opposed. That motion carries. I turn to Director Smith.
So I would like to make two recommendations, or possibly 3. So do I make one at a time?
That's what's being recommended.
Okay, recommend to the board that the CVRD staff include in the corporate strategic asset management plan a breakdown of each utility system's parcel tax to include the portion for operations, maintenance, and portion for capital asset infrastructure.
You move that?
I do.
Is there a seconder? Fails for lack of a seconder. Next motion.
That the CVRD staff include in the corporate strategic asset management plan the amount of each utility system's parcel taxation user fee spent on capital asset infrastructure over the past 10 years, not including any grant resource funds.
We have a seconder. Were you seconding that? Ms. Soldera?
Sorry, just for clarification, your resolution says to include in the asset management plan, and I think that you're actually wanting us to include it in our evaluation of projects for the 30% gas tax funding, not in the asset management plan itself.
I believe she has this in writing for you. So I have a quick question. So is this, in effect, you want to backcast over the last 10 years, the analysis and for our future decision-making? That's the intent of this. Okay.
Yeah, the intent is to look at how much of the parcel tax and user fee has been spent over the capital asset, capital asset infrastructure over the past 10 years.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Director Acton?
Well, I don't understand the scope of work by that resolution. Are we sending staff away to produce a huge amount of work? Just to, I'm not sure what the purpose of all that is, so.
I look to staff. Sounds like a lot of work to me. Director Kuhn?
Yeah, I wonder, would it be a lot of work?
I've
Through the
got
chair.
hands all around the room here, but I was going to go to finance first, but
Yeah, through the chair to Director Kuhn, yes, finance staff would have to sit down with engineering staff, review each of the systems, go through, figure out exactly how much funds, as Mr. Dennison has mentioned, the parcel taxes are a revenue stream, so we'd have to identify if it was attached to capital and go back and do that for each system all the way through for the last 10 years.
Director Kuhn?
Well, my next question is, if we do get that information, is that going to satisfy everybody? And I'm absolutely convinced it won't. So where do we go from there? So now staff has spent an awful lot of time bringing us that information. We still can't agree on who gets what. And we dive deeper. There's no end to as to how deep we can go on this in order to try to get justice. And I don't think, I can't see myself in voting in favor of that, because it's going back 10 years. Is, I mean, you're dealing with decisions that have been made long ago, and how is it going to solve anything? And I just doubt if it will.
Director Smith?
What I think it does is it shows who, as taxpayers, have actually stepped up to the plate to work on their aging infrastructure. The funds that have been allocated are for projects, for utilities that are aging. I think it's very important that we see how much is being put into some of these assets that are liabilities under our utilities. If areas are not increasing their taxation or user fees to actually address those financial responsibilities, then it will become clear if you see actually how much money is going into that asset. And yes, of course, it won't look fair when you have a larger system and a smaller system, but at least you'll see that system is trying to financially take a handle on addressing their system and their financial responsibility to that system.
Seeing no other hands, call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion's defeated. Your third resolution.
Most likely, it's not worth putting any more resolutions on the floor. I'm very disappointed. All I can say is I'm very proud of Soltaire for actually stepping up and increasing their property taxes by 171% in 2013 to start addressing approximately $13 million worth of aging infrastructure and upgrades. They took on a financial responsibility 7 years ago. They've managed to pay and put $1.5 million into their asset, and we've cut down on the brakes in our area, which has in return made it possible for us to put additional funds. The engineering
Director Smith, can I
department-
ask for a resolution, please?
No, I'd like to continue
Well,
because
if
I'm
you put a
very-
resolution on the floor, then you can speak to it.
I'd like to thank the engineering staff for all that they've done, but I'm disappointed in a lot of the other electoral areas that haven't actually stepped up since 2017 ANOVA report to increase the taxation to address their financial responsibilities for their systems.
Are you proposing a resolution? Director Nicholson.
So when this report comes back, I would be interested in some options being provided around an appropriate cap on percentage that can go to a system from this money. I would be interested in understanding some sort of ranking on achieving this idea of amalgamation, if they contribute to any system amalgamation issues. So I think we need to use that as a criterion for setting priorities. And the other issue that I think that we haven't addressed is we're dealing with aging infrastructure, but I think some idea about new standards and how those factor in and ability to pay would be helpful.
Is that a motion?
Yeah, I'd like that included in the report. Or in how they...
Hang on. Do we have a seconder? Motion fails for lack of a seconder. Any other motions? Seeing none, I believe that takes us to the end of our open session. Any unfinished business?
There is none.
Any new business?
There is none, Mr. Chair.
Come to question period. Do we have any civilians in the audience? And none of the rest of you better get up and ask any questions. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Then the motion before you is to that the meeting be closed to the public in accordance with Community Charter Part 4, Division 3, Section 90, subsections 1G, 1F.
As the items listed below, thank you. Moved by Director Kuhn, second by Director Yanni DiNardo, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Take 5 minutes.